Hi everybody, and welcome to another episode of Inside Stonelink. My name is Justin Mann, and today I'm here, and I'm lucky to be here with Marc Gertsacov. Marc is a real estate attorney. He has been operating in the state for more than 20 years. And in today's episode, we are going to be talking about how a real estate attorney can help you as a real estate investor or somebody interested in investing in real estate navigate that process, how Marc and somebody in his role can help through that process, when to engage them, and some of the pitfalls that you can avoid if you have that knowledge. So if you're interested in learning about these things, you definitely want to stay tuned for today's episode. Marc, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
I appreciate it.
Awesome. Marc, full disclosure, you and I have known each other for several years. We've actually had the chance to work together on some deals together. I've had the pleasure of working with you. I learned early on the font of knowledge that you are and what you bring to the real estate space from an attorney's perspective. But for the audience that doesn't know you, maybe you could tell a little bit about yourself, including the big change that just happened in your world, and tell them a little bit more about yourself.
All right, well, we'll start a little bit earlier, right? So born and bred in Cranston, Rhode Island. I went to high school at Cranston East, proud graduate. And then I went off to Skidmore College, spent 5 years after that living in San Francisco, then decided I think I need to go to law school. And, with a little help, get serious, a little help from my mother to decide maybe come back east.
Thanks, Mom.
Thank you for instilling that guilt into me. And so I ended up going to Brooklyn Law School, which was the best law school I got into on the East Coast. Loved it there. I had two brothers living in the city at the same time, bunch of friends. It was a really great time in my life. I met my wife, now wife, there. When I graduated law school, sort of looking into the future a little bit, I realized New York wasn't my home.
Okay.
Come back to Rhode Island. I could be a little bit bigger fish in a smaller pond. And so start my law practice there. I was thankful enough to be able to do that. I started working with a guy named Jay Marinelli.
Yep.
I think a lot of people might already know him, Parnagian Marinelli. I knew him from a long time ago. He was my brother's older friend. It's Rhode Island. So
everybody knows somebody.
Everybody knows somebody. So I used to lean on Jay a lot during law school. How do I get through this class? He had just broken out on his own when I just got out of law school. So
real estate law?
In real estate law.
Okay.
He was doing real estate law, and so I came out, I graduated 2000, and it was a little hot and heavy in the refinance market at that time. Rates were coming down from 7 to 6 to 5, right? So I was learning the trade of being a closing attorney, right? Really, they were doing 70, 80 a month. Had a nice little operation going. I was learning exactly what to do, how to do it. After 2 years with him, a guy named Ron Markov had an opening at his office, and Ron had been the dean of title for eons.
So at this point, you're pot committed to real estate.
I'm pot committed.
Because when somebody goes into, be an attorney, right, it's kind of like saying, I want to be a doctor. Okay, that's great. That's a pretty broad spectrum. Why did you decide to focus on real estate? Did you fall into it or did you choose it?
I chose it.
Okay.
I chose it. I knew I didn't want to be a litigator.
Okay.
Right? I knew I didn't have that passion, unfortunately, to save the homeless and feed the hungry and do all those things that some other people in law school really had a passion for.
Wasn't your calling?
Wasn't my calling. I've always been focused on real estate. My father was a small developer.
So you had some exposure early on.
Little exposure, and I figured that was like sort of a good place for me with my skill set. Right?
Yep.
I'm a good listener. I can explain things well to a lot of people. I cross a lot of paths. And so I figured real estate was the best sort of format for me to show my skills. Plus, I really don't like the litigation aspect of law.
So it was the right fit. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you were working with Ron Markov for a better part of 18 years?
Almost 20.
Almost 20 years,
Almost
okay.
20 years. He passed, unfortunately, June of 22.
Okay.
And after we had sort of had a succession plan, we had merged into a larger law firm.
You were there for a couple of years.
So I was there for a couple of years. And then fast forward to March of 2024, I said, you know what? I'm on my own. It's time for me to sort of put on my big boy pants, do it by myself. I have a whole host of clients, and followers and a lot of support behind me. So I figured now was the best time to make that jump.
We're excited for that. So now that we know and the audience knows a little bit more about you, Marc, let's jump into this.
Sure.
So after 23, 24 years in the space, to say the least, you've learned a lot about real estate. Where I want to start this discussion is I'm a real estate investor already, or I'm interested in becoming a real estate investor from the buy side, right? Sure. So I'm looking to buy a property. Maybe I found it. Maybe I haven't found that property yet. The first question I'd have for you, and I'm really coming at this from the perspective of somebody that's never done this before. When I'm starting out as a real estate investor, from your perspective, sure, what do I need to know? When am I engaging somebody like you? When do I need to start looking for a real estate attorney to add to my team if I've really decided this is what I want to do? I want to go after, I want to build a portfolio, or maybe I just want one property. But let's start, when do they engage with you? And from your perspective, what should they be doing in those first stages?
All right, so first I think engaging me as early as possible.
Okay.
Or any attorney as early as possible. Generally, real estate attorneys, we get paid at the closing.
Okay.
So when you meet with me for the first time, you call me up, we either have coffee, you come to the office, wherever it is, you have me go tour the property with you, I'm happy to do that.
Okay.
I'm not asking you to sign a retainer agreement and here's my big engagement fee, right? Here,
right.
I'm not doing that. This is for me, creating relationships. I want you to sort of use me as a sounding board.
Okay.
What are you looking to do? How much money do you have to invest? Are you looking to borrow the whole thing?
Right.
Are you looking to sort of get a bank involved? Do you need to form an LLC? Do you want to be in a partnership? What sort of investment are you looking at?
Okay.
All right. So and we can flush those things out.
So those are some critical questions that need to be answered. You mentioned a couple of things. Number one, do I need an LLC? Which is a discussion I'd like to have. Sure. Number two, hey, financing, because you got to buy this thing. Are you a cash buyer, like true cash buyer? You're bringing, a bag full of money to the table. Are you going to be financing? If so, do you already have a lender picked out? And these are some things that you might be able to give some guidance on.
Sure.
But let's start early on in this journey, right? So forming an LLC, yes or no? When you're talking to a real estate investor, to be clear, we're talking about somebody that's looking to purchase a property that is not going to be their primary residence. Correct. It's going to be let's assume it's residential, and it's going to be for investment purposes. Do you recommend that if they don't already have one, that they form an LLC to purchase that property? What's your guidance there?
That's a personal decision.
Okay.
It really is. I have some clients that have an LLC for every single property.
Okay.
And they may have 75 different properties.
And so 75 different LLCs.
75 different LLCs.
And why would they do that? Legally speaking.
Legally speaking, it is separating sort of each stalk from the rest.
Okay.
Right? So now you have a big pile of sticks, but each stick can stand independently of itself.
Okay.
If something happened at one, it's not going to affect the other unless you're commingling. But those cases, right? That's a lot of work to manage 75 different LLCs.
I would think
Which
so.
Property is this? Which card do I use?
Right.
Where do I pay the insurance? What bank account am I using?
Right.
Those things, sometimes you've heard of piercing the corporate veil.
Yep.
When you fail at one of those things, sometimes other creditors or people that you might try to avoid their liability,
yep,
they may latch onto something. You paid for gas for this property with another card, therefore you're trying to
commingling funds.
You're commingling. So I have one investor, I think well over 3,000, 4,000 units. I mean, big time investor all across the country. He does everything in his individual name.
Really?
He takes out a huge insurance policy, big umbrella policy.
Okay.
What's going to happen? The buildings all have insurance. They're all professionally managed.
Right.
It's more cumbersome for him in his estimation.
So he owns 3,000, 4,000 units, whatever it is, in different states all across the country, and they're all in his personal name. And yet I know from either clients that we work with and ourselves, we actually do set up our different LLCs.
Sure.
Not necessarily for every individual building, though I have seen that. For somebody just starting out, though, this can seem a little bit daunting. I'm looking to buy my first 3-family in Pawtucket or somewhere.
And the other question becomes, how are you getting your financing?
Okay.
Right.
Fair.
So the financing.
So how does that factor into, do I create an LLC or don't I create an LLC?
Right. So how are you paying for it? If you have financing lined up, your cash in your pocket,
right,
and you're going to put it down there, maybe it's coming from a 401k, maybe it's coming from another financing source, you might be able to say, great, I'll put it in an LLC because I don't have any underwriting concerns from a lender.
Okay.
If you went to a bank and said, I have an LLC, 123 Main Street, they're going to say, great. Everything's going to be in the LLC name. Now this is a commercial loan.
Right.
We're going to have commercial terms, which
Right.
might mean a 5-year term, 10-year term. I have seen some 20 and 25-year commercial terms, but you pay a little bit more to get started.
So to be clear then, if you're setting up an LLC, one of the major considerations, as you said at the outset of this, is how are you buying this building?
Right.
Because if you can just bring a big pile of cash or be a cash buyer, it's easier to set up that LLC and just have the LLC buy the building, as it were.
Right.
But if you don't have the cash and you are borrowing money and you're trying to have the LLC borrow the money, as it were,
Right.
the bank is really evaluating that LLC. It changes it from being maybe a residential loan to a commercial note.
Right.
So interest rates could be affected, loan to values could be affected, maturity dates, insurance, all of these. So to your point, there's a lot of considerations when deciding whether or not to buy that property in an LLC or not.
Correct.
Okay.
And it's also sometimes it's if you and I, right, we're not family related,
right,
but we wanted to invest together, an LLC might be a better avenue than you and I being partners.
Okay.
Right? Who's your investor mix? Right? Because if we're partners, I'm responsible for everything that you do.
Yep.
Right? In your own individual name, you're driving a car down the street and you decide, rather hit somebody. I'm responsible for that because now we're a partnership and they could go after my interest in the building that we own together.
How does an LLC protect against
because
that?
Now you're not driving unless you're driving the LLC's car.
Okay,
unless you're acting in the LLC's capacity.
LLC, if you have multiple parties, maybe it's not just me, and you bring up a very good point. So in a multiple,
or your spouse, right?
Okay,
sometimes you and
fair.
your spouse can act together, no
Right.
problem. But
certainly more than one party, especially if they're not related, would you then really recommend or counsel to setting up an LLC for those individuals,
Yes.
if nothing else, to separate personal liability from commercial liability over here? Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Okay.
We talk LLCs. Sometimes it's a corporation.
Okay.
Right? We're small corporation and S corporation.
Yep.
We make that election. It depends on sort of your investor mix and what they're comfortable with. I like the LLC for a variety of reasons. One
Yep.
being a little bit easier to operate than if there's a shareholder issue, because corporations have been around for a little bit longer. So the longer they've been around, the more laws that have been shaped and coddled and sort of mended to protect the minority interests of shareholders.
Okay.
Where LLCs haven't been around as long. So there's less
So there's a
law.
distinction there. Yeah.
There's less law that sort of, you still have to do a lot of fair dealing, right, in good faith.
Right.
But there's, a minority member doesn't have the same rights as a minority shareholder.
So even how you set up that corporation matters.
Or LLC.
Or LLC, as the case may be. All right, so we don't lose this new investor, because again, we want to kind of speak to somebody, as it were, that's just getting into this, or may have bought their first investment property not through an LLC. Maybe they didn't even use an attorney. They found out the neighbor's house next door was going to be selling. They were like, oh, this is great. It's right next to me. I can manage it easily. I've got some extra cash because I just inherited, or I just had a windfall for whatever reason, and they just did it. But now they're realizing, wait a minute, I kind of need to know more about this. So we've talked about whether or not to set up an LLC or a corporation, some of the factors that contribute to that decision making. You've talked a little bit about how and when to engage a real estate attorney as early as possible. That consultation needs to happen. A lot of questions can start to get answered. Once we're through those initial stages, right? How does a real estate attorney help? Let's say I found a property and I'm starting to go through that initial process where either I've signed a purchase and sales agreement, or I've made an offer and it's been accepted and we're really early stages. Where does a real estate attorney fit into that journey, that part of the process?
Certainly. So you found a property, now you want to contract for that property.
Right.
You want to memorialize your agreement with that seller. So you want to put pen to paper. You want to have an attorney look at that to protect all your interests. You may have other contingencies. You want to inspect the property. Right. You may need financing. You certainly want to make sure, if it's a multi-unit building, that it's zoned for multi-units, right? And those number of units that have been advertised. There are a lot of properties out there in some of these older neighborhoods that have it's a 2-unit, but there's always been 4 apartments here.
Okay.
Or it's 4 units, there's always been 8
Yep.
apartments. People snuck in units. You want to make sure that you're not buying into some headache.
I can remember a personal story when you and I were first met early in the relationship. I had a client who had bought a 3-family, at least it had 3 floors, and it was sold as a 3-family, so on and so forth. But there were then, after the fact, there was some discussion around, was it truly a 3-family? You actually pointed me in the direction of going to the original archives, looking at the original census that superseded what was on file with the city, and we were able to determine, no, actually, in fact, it really was a legal 3, even though the card they had on file was a 2-family. Is that, you maybe recall that?
I remember that, and I've given that sort of advice to a lot of people, especially older parts of the city.
Right.
It may have been built as a 3-family, but it was the guy's daughter that was living upstairs with her child.
Right.
It wasn't married. But it could have been sort of 2 families on the title record when the city came by and made their register. But, 30, 40 years ago, because it was built as a 3-family, had 3 separate families living there. And so they grandfathered in. That's sort of legal non-conforming is what they call it. Sometimes you have to provide the right records to the city to inform them of what they should have on their records.
I remember it well. Yeah.
But and usually the city's pretty fair about doing that, and in general about seeking some other relief.
Yep.
I think the city wants.
No,
the cities are abiding by it because they know housing's such an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, the city responded. They looked at the data and they said, "Yep, no, it is what it is." So I guess to really kind of bring it back to the original question, we're at the point where we want to make an offer. We want to memorialize the offer, as it were. One of the key roles that you're playing as a real estate attorney is ensuring that that buyer is actually purchasing what is being represented.
Correct.
Is it really what is being presented, or is it something else, in which case maybe the deal needs to be revisited? You're selling it as a 3, but actually all records point to that it's legally a 2. You can't represent it one way but sell it another. And so there's an opportunity for you there to step in and say, this is what reality is, this is what the truth is showing.
Sure. And then also, just not the number of units, sometimes it's where the parking is located.
Okay.
Right? Because
Sure.
a lot of times people are using other folks' land as their historical parking area, but it's really not their property. They were using it by agreement.
Okay.
Right? And we've seen or you may be thinking you're buying the whole property, but really the house that you're looking up might have been made up of 3 lots, and they're going to sell you 2 instead of all 3.
Right. So we need to agree on everything.
Things and make sure that you're buying, you're getting your benefit of bargain.
So when you've been through, so we've gotten through that stage, if you will.
Right.
We've vetted the deal, as it were. You've written the language into the P&S, contingencies and all that. Everybody's signed.
Satisfied.
Everything's satisfied. Next step, right? So you go through your contingency process. Where do you typically see yourself after the deal has been memorialized? P&S is agreed upon. Everybody's shook in hands and say, yep, this is this, and everything is straightened out there. Right. Where do you go next?
Once we have a contract, there's typically a little bit of a lag time between contract signing and closing day.
Sure.
Maybe it's 20, 30, 60 days, depending on the nature of the deal. In that interim, I'm doing a title exam, making sure that the seller, doesn't have any outstanding liens, mortgages are going to get paid off. There are no violations against the property by the housing authority.
Okay.
There aren't any other surprises that we need to be dealing with. I just had a closing last week where there was a lead line loan. The sellers had taken out a loan from the Providence Water to replace the lead pipes in their house.
Okay.
It was like a $10,000 loan. There was $5,000 left over, thereabouts, on that payoff. My buyers, we had to make sure that $5,000 wasn't their responsibility.
Had you not caught that, let's just play this out. Had you not caught that, or let's say they weren't using somebody as adept as you, as skilled as you, as experienced as you, maybe they were doing it on their own because they're like, oh, these people seem like nice sellers, we'll just work it out. Sure. Let's say in good faith it had gotten missed. What happens in that situation?
That lien follows the house.
So the buyer would have assumed the liability that truly was the seller's responsibility. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay.
That's fair.
So one of the things, a key role that you're playing is making sure that your client, whether it's the buyer or the seller, is protected through the process. I mean, at its highest level, you're looking out for, in this case, the buyer's interest to make sure that they are buying what is being presented. What is being presented is what is actually there, and that there are no other elements to the deal that are not been presented that could ultimately end up essentially being a liability or money out of the pocket of the buyer that was unlooked for or unexpected.
That's all correct. And in addition to, I'm also providing title insurance.
Okay, so talk a little bit about that.
So in my sort of dual role as an attorney, I'm also a title insurance agent.
Okay.
And what that does is I'm issuing a title insurance policy on behalf of a number of different companies that we represent that gives to the buyer a nice title policy that says if there was ever a problem, if anybody ever challenges your ownership in this property or any other essential element of ownership, right, then you would have an ability to go back against the title insurance company and they would pay you, defend your claim, and make sure it's yours, or they'd pay you face value of the insurance policy plus a little bit of an inflation premium.
Okay, so you're kind of giving them the get out of jail free card because you're saying, look, I've done the due diligence, this title's clean, I'm going to put an insurance policy against it, and if something were to come up down the line, we got you.
Right.
Okay.
And that's also not only for the seller or the buyer, but also for the buyer's lender.
Okay.
The lender is going to require their own title insurance policy to make sure that nobody is ahead of that lender in any sort of claim of interest.
Okay.
Like that water lien.
So they would basically be able to find that out and deal with it versus, again, had it not been discovered, then it would have come up after the fact and there would have been a whole dispute after.
Big nest of problems.
Yeah, that you got to go back.
A lot of pointing fingers and the seller should have done this or the buyer's attorney should have, or title and company should have done that.
And all of a sudden, nobody's friends.
Right, and it's relatively small number.
Right.
So the buyer probably would have said lumped it, right, and said, well, it's not worth the headache to do it. I'll just pay the $5 on my own.
Right. Which could have been avoided all along.
Could have been avoided all along.
So we're farther along into the process now. What's next? Okay.
So we're working also after I do my title exam, I'm working with the lender to make sure that they have what they need from my perspective so they can continue underwriting the property and making sure that they're ready for a closing. Okay. And then we set up the closing. I quarterback with the seller or the seller's attorney, the different agents. As a buyer's attorney, I'm also known as the settlement agent. So all the funds for the transaction are flowing through my office. Okay. And then they go out after the closing, after I've recorded the documents, I've been funded by the buyer and the lender. Then I can record the deed, and then I can give seller here's the balance of, you sold your house for $500, we paid off your bank for $200, we paid off everybody else, here's your balance of $285. Right,
and here's your ticket to Florida, you can finally go.
Go forward, go and enjoy.
Go and enjoy the rest of your life. Enjoy.
Oh, and by the way, here's a 1099 too. Remember to pay your taxes.
The part Uncle Sam gets their due.
Everybody loves that.
Yeah, that's probably the least favorite part. In that final stage, question for you, where do you see deals fall apart? What are some things that can cause it? Everybody knows that real estate it's not done until it's done. Ink is on paper. Correct. And then even after ink is on paper, as we just discovered, there can be things that creep up or pop up, as it were, that have to be revisited. But before the deal even closes, in those final stages, what are some things that you have seen in your decades worth of experience that have popped up?
Property conditions. Okay. Right? Some big rainstorm happened the night before the closing, and there's a flood in the basement.
That would be certainly a reason to revisit either the closing date, if that issue can be remediated, or have you seen that actually blow up a deal completely?
I've seen a couple deals blow up completely because the seller said, I waterproofed this basement, there's not going to have any problem whatsoever, and it was nice and clean on the walk.
And now you got a lake.
And now you got a big puddle in the, So some people have walked away and we ended up fighting over it.
So generally people don't like water features in their basement. Got it. Okay.
Some other things are, buyer sometimes, they lose a job. right?
Got it.
After they've qualified, they've sort of taken on new debt. I had a guy moving from Florida one time. He was moving from Florida. His truck died and right in front of a dealership. Says it must be an omen. He went into the Ford dealership, bought himself a new truck, continued on his journey.
Yeah.
I said, there's no closing. You have more debt than you qualify for. So we had a 2 weeks. The loan guy massaged it a little bit. He worked his numbers, but these are problems that arise, right? And it's, again, it's not over till it's all recorded and deals dispersed.
And I think that's a great, I'm imagining this guy who probably, or this woman or whatever, buys this new car, new truck, thinking nothing of it, like, oh, this is great, I'm getting a new property, I'm getting a new car, life is good, I'm going to be driving off literally into the sunset.
He had plenty of funds. He wasn't, sort of like...
But his debt-to-income ratios changed.
Right, exactly. Those little small things that the bank's concerned about.
So this would probably be a good segue into another question. What are some pitfalls other than the one you just mentioned? Or another way to think about it is, what is some advice that you would give certainly first-time in real estate investment buyers, right, through this entire process?
Right.
We've heard about get engaged early and often, right? So let's sit down and counsel. Once you've identified a property, you're going to continue with that engagement. You're going to be giving counsel and start doing your due diligence process. But as you look at this and you say to yourself, okay, if you had an opportunity, and I came to you as a first-time real estate investment buyer, what's some advice that you would be giving to me to try to set me up for success?
Know your tenant class. Know what you're going to be providing to them and what they're going to be expecting.
Okay.
Some people want to make their properties worth more than they're ever going to get in rent.
Right.
And when they put in a brand new fancy granite kitchen with all the stainless and they've done everything in central air, it doesn't warrant what they want to command in rent.
Right.
And so now they're a little upside down on the sort of rent. So, and then they try to be greedy because, they're trying to get the top of the market. And, when you get a little too greedy or aggressive with the price, you get problem tenants.
Okay.
Right?
So know your resident or tenant class that you're working with as far as, what is this property really going to be able to rent for based on where it is, what it is, and how it's presented. So I hear that loud and clear. Be realistic about your expectations vis-a-vis rental income.
Sure.
I think that ties into what you were just saying.
Yeah. Because you're going to have that person who can't really afford it, who's stretching too much.
Right.
They're going to not pay you for a month and give you a song and dance.
Yep.
And if you don't have a responsible property management company, right, sort of really proactive, most landlords, they believe you for the first few months.
Yep.
And then it's all of a sudden, you're 4 months, you haven't been paid. And you've been taking the rent, your money out of your pocket, paying the mortgage and the taxes and the insurance where it should be the tenant's money, doing all those things. And then you have to engage an attorney. I don't handle evictions. I deal with a lot of landlords, but I don't go to court.
Yeah.
We have other people that specialize in that.
That's what they do.
That's what they do. They do it much less expensive, better than I can do it.
Let me ask you this, as you're talking about this and I'm thinking about it, from a property manager perspective, we also like to get engaged as early and as often as possible. And one of the things that we're always telling either existing clients or new clients if they're looking to buy is, and I would love your intake on this and your feedback on this if I may, verify what is being presented. So are there leases in place? If not, can you get estoppel letters? What about a certified rent roll? What about some sort of verification of security deposits? All of that documentation, the actual utility bills, so we can see what the expense is. If there's common area meters, what are those utility bills versus some spreadsheet? Would you agree those are good things to be asking for on the buy side?
Of course.
Okay.
Of course. That's what you're buying.
Right. I mean, essentially, it's the numbers.
Correct. You're buying sort of a building in the real estate,
right?
But you're also buying those tenants and all the headaches or not headaches associated with it, right?
Right.
So if the meters are all in the tenants' names and everything's hunky-dory the way it should be, perfect. If they're not, then that might affect your numbers as to what you value that for.
And are those things that you have seen even some lenders would require?
Depends on the loan.
Okay.
It depends on the loan. The more units.
Yep.
it becomes a more commercial deal. The more it gets underwritten, the more people are looking at those.
Start asking more questions.
Right, those questions. I just
Okay.
did a closing in Central Falls. It was 17 units. Rhode Island Housing provided nice financing. And they looked at all the leases to make sure that,
Right.
we had an estoppel. It was a little bit of pain in the neck to get 17 different tenants to agree that this is actually a rents and security deposit, but it gets done.
Yep.
Right, it gets done.
Okay. So now let's kind of flip the script, right?
Sure.
We've been talking a lot about from the buy side, but you obviously also represent sellers.
All the time.
Okay. So if I'm a seller, it's a little bit of a different scenario, right? Because A, I have the product. B, I'm going to determine when it gets sold. I'm not, out there figuring, oh, when is somebody going to come ask me to sell my property? Although that does happen in today's market. And it's pretty obvious for most sellers, well, gee, I probably should engage a broker a real estate broker, a real estate agent, so I can determine the value, right? Let's figure out what the market will bear, figure out what to list this thing for. But same question. So I'm a seller. When am I engaging you as a real estate attorney?
Well, one, to help you with the whole process.
Okay, right? So again, early on,
review the contracts, maybe with the broker, to make sure that those are fair and reasonable terms that you're agreeing with.
Between the seller and the broker, or the real estate agent.
The real estate agent, right? There's a listing agreement that they have.
Sure.
Right? So look at that. Look at sort of the ownership structure. We've had a lot of deals lately that people have gotten their LLC.
Yeah.
They filed 10 years ago, they filed an annual report for the first year, forgot to do it for years 2 and 3.
Okay.
Eventually the Secretary of State said, you're no longer a good, viable LLC.
Okay.
But they've kept the name in, the 123 Realty LLC all these years.
Right.
What they didn't realize is their LLC's been revoked, all the liability fell to them personally.
So as a seller, they would need to know that early on, because
they want to make sure they can get their LLC reinstated by the Secretary of State, or if it can't be reinstated,
create a new one.
Well, you can't literally create a new one for the same one.
Right.
You could use a similar name.
No, that's what I meant, right? So
But
create a new LLC.
But you have to get it out of 123 Main Street LLC's title first.
Right.
It's in that title.
So is that a quit claim deed from one to the next? Or
Well, the title companies have allowed affidavits just from the members themselves.
Okay.
For these sort of reinstatable LLCs.
Okay.
In Rhode Island, a corporation or an LLC, if you've been revoked for more than 10 years,
Yep.
it requires a legislative act to actually reinstate that company.
So getting back to the original kind of premise of the question, when to engage you and why? Well, I think we've just established early. A few other reasons. Okay, so they've done that.
Yeah.
They've engaged you, started the process. You vetted the listing agreement. You've looked at the LLC if it exists. Gone through that whole process, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's in the person's name.
We would then obviously work with the buyer's attorney and make sure that they were preparing a deed.
Okay.
And we're getting the necessary affidavits, either residency affidavits or non-resident withholding requirements. Sometimes it's foreign investors in real estate.
Right.
So we have other issues, nationalistic issues to contend with.
Interesting.
There's a
Okay.
giant withholding.
Okay.
Almost 15%. If you're a foreign national, not sort of legally here with an ITIN, you would have a big withholding at closing, which we can reduce if we apply to the IRS early enough.
But that's a process. And it's clearly going to extend the closing time.
Depends on if you engage me early enough and we identified issues and we gave ourselves a long enough ramp to sort of, hey, look, this isn't a 30-day issue. You're going to need 60 days to close.
This to be clear, so I'm a foreign national, but I own a property here in Rhode Island. Maybe I own it in Providence. I want to sell it. All right, that's my right. I can do so. But I would want to engage you. You're going to find out I'm a foreign national. It's like, hey, by the way, they're going to withhold 15%. I'm going to throw up my hand and say, whoa, 15%, I can't have that. I need it to be 5 or 10%.
Right.
That's fine. We're going to have to file a petition with the IRS. We're going to need to do that now, not after you've got a purchase and sales agreement and you've tried to set up a close, basically a timetable to close from that point. You really want to do it from time of listing.
You need the purchase and sales agreement so you know your price.
Okay.
right? And so you can factor those things in because when you do file with the IRS.
Okay.
So you're actually talking pretty real numbers, right? It's not just I've listed it for $1 million and it's going to sell for 900. That would change that math dramatically.
So they need to at least be at that stage in the process.
But know that the buyer is going to have to wait 60 days.
Okay.
Instead of the buyer wants 30 days.
So you mentioned something earlier, as far as representing the seller, you're then at some point obviously engage the buyer's attorney. What if there isn't one? Two-part question. Have you found yourself where you represent both the buyer and the seller, both sides of the deal? And if so, beyond the obvious, it seems like there could be a conflict of interest there. What have you found in that scenario where you've represented both sides?
So it happens where sometimes we have the clients obviously sign a waiver of conflict.
Okay.
Right, because I can't, as the saying goes, ride two horses at once.
Right.
So I become more of that neutral facilitator.
Okay.
Right. I'm just acting. You guys so Justin and your buyer. Right, you made your own deal.
Right.
I'm there to make sure that deal occurs.
Right.
Justin sells to the buyer for the price negotiated at all the same terms.
Yep.
Do it fair and square. I'm usually encouraging somebody to get another attorney involved, just so I
Certainly cleaner.
Certainly a lot cleaner.
Yeah.
Yesterday, it happened last night. I have a seller who's commercial selling 3 units. He has an interested buyer, but the buyer is coming from out of state.
Okay.
They're looking for an attorney. I suggested 2 attorneys to that buyer. Both of those attorneys didn't engage with that buyer. She asked me yesterday, can I buy it? I said, it's a little too sticky, too messy because she has her own interests that are going to be in conflict, I know, with my client's interests.
Okay.
Right? So we're going to I found her another attorney to hopefully help facilitate her because they're going to have to set up on this particular transaction, it's a commercial deal, they're going to have to set up a LLC for an LLC for the buyer, liquor licenses are involved, other licensing will be involved. It would be a little bit too much if I also, because I'm continuing to represent.
So that's a situation where you're going to say, I can't do this. Seem like a nice person, but this is
too messy.
Right.
I know that there could be a potential for issue here for conflict. Now, if you're just residential house closing and this is a nice clean deal and you're a seller and you're a buyer, I'm happy to just prepare the seller's documents as an administrative task.
Right.
Where I'm not really representing the seller. The seller did.
It's a means to an end. You're getting across the finish line.
I'm preparing a deed and a residency affidavits. I'm not really acting as an attorney. More of a transactionalist.
Well, you bring this up, and I'm glad you did. So do you find, and maybe this is a good question to ask, even though our audience are really real estate investors or those looking to become real estate investors, do you find there is more or less issues on the commercial side or on the residential side? Distinction being the real estate investor versus the homeowner, right?
Right.
I'm just going out to buy my my 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in Pawtucket, right? And I just want to live in that house versus I'm buying that 3-family house, that commercial deal in Pawtucket. Right. Where do you typically see more issues in that?
Oh, of course, on the investment side.
Okay.
Right? There are a lot more moving parts. Right?
Because I would assume so, but I'm not in your shoes.
So, the person who's buying a nice 3-bedroom house for themselves, for their family, obviously have a lot of concerns with, that's probably the largest investment or one of them that they're ever going to make in their life.
Okay.
They have to take care and concern with it. It's a piece of real estate. It's not lunch out.
Yeah.
It's, it's a real
you could argue it's a business in and of itself.
Correct. And that's sometimes why I wonder why people buy $20 million houses for themselves when they could buy a $20 million apartment building.
Different discussion, another great session I'd love to have.
Yeah, but I don't know. But so anyway, personal satisfaction. But so that person buying their own house, obviously you give them all the care and concern that they need to be attended to. But the investor is one, they got their corporate structure.
Right.
They're going to have 3 different tenants, right? They're sort of revenue streams.
Right.
3 different revenue streams. They may be coming out
that
of
the
one
bank's going to care a lot about if this is a finance deal.
If they got to have financing,
right?
There's going to be insurance concerns, right? You want to have other, if a property manager is being involved, right?
Okay.
Because then, how are they going to deal with those concerns at 2 a.m.
Yep.
when the pipes aren't working the way they should be?
Have you ever counseled, here's a question for you. Have you ever counseled somebody from purchasing because you really didn't think what they were looking to buy, they were equipped or prepared to do so?
Always.
Okay.
Yeah, because
Maybe you can give us an example.
So
we won't name names to protect the innocent.
no. So some people, it's, they're coming into Rhode Island specifically from outside of Rhode Island.
Okay.
Right? And the valuations in New York, right? If we're in Queens, New York, you're trying to buy a 3-family house in Queens, and it could be 3,500 square foot house. It's going to be $1.6 million.
Yep.
When you come to Providence, you say, oh my gosh, I can buy this 3-family house, same size. I can get it in South Providence or Central Falls, or, they look like the Queens neighborhood.
Yeah.
Right? A nice mixed
Very
community.
different market.
Different market entirely. Yeah. And they don't realize that some parts of South Providence are a historic district.
Yeah.
So when you go to replace those windows, they're going to have to be historic qualified.
To say nothing for the fact that there's a historic commission that you have to go through, and you have to get approval for change. That's a whole other discussion.
Yeah, that's a whole other big giant headache. But it's hey, look, if you look at the neighborhood, you're in a historic district.
Right.
2 streets over, you're not.
So there's a situation where you might say, I know you like this place, but you really should be looking at this place, and here's why.
Correct. And so I can add a lot of local sort of knowledge.
Okay.
Right. I've had some investors that get along great with the city of Providence's building department.
Okay.
Right. Other clients are saying, I am not going towards that city building department because I can't get along with anybody in there.
Right.
And all they do is make a mockery of me.
Okay.
So it's,
some bad blood, whatever the
depending
case is.
on sort of what you want to do and where you want to do it, and other people want to be builders ground up.
Yep.
Right? Certain towns are going to be a little bit easier to operate than other towns.
As a cautionary tale, and this can be from the buy side, the sell side, maybe both, what are some things in your decades of experience that you've seen from either side that have driven you nuts, that you would say, God, if only they had just done this or not done that?
I think sometimes trusting the wrong people.
Great.
Right. So I had a wonderful lady. She's passed on. She was a very good investor. We became really good friends.
Okay.
What happened to her is in about 2003, 4, Rhode Island had a big upswing, right? And she was buying 3 families and converting to condominiums.
Okay.
Right, which is a nice process. And then
we'll talk about that in a minute.
She would sell those condominiums and make good profit. And then she got a little bit bigger and she started taking on a 6 unit. She hired a new contractor. The contractor put 1/2-inch sheet board around the whole place, which was, pretty major investment.
Right.
And when the fire department said it needs to be 5/8 to meet fire code.
Yeah.
And because the fire department is pretty stringent on these things.
Right.
Has to meet fire
They don't have
code.
a sense of humor at all, which they shouldn't.
And, that tanked her whole project. Right?
And that's it.
That's it. She had financing that was very expensive. Right? The financier didn't care that she picked the wrong contractor.
And she was
suing the contractor for over 6 figures, right? He redid the house, and it got finished, and then it turned out to be 1/2-inch versus 5/8. She ended up having to go bankrupt.
Wow.
Right? So very sad story because she trusted the wrong guy.
The wrong person.
Yep.
All right. That's great advice.
I mean, it's like you really, the people that you're going to do business with, you really have to vet. Right?
At all levels. Because it's interesting,
your insurance person, right? The painter,
right?
Make sure that, all right, great, I can hire another painter. It will only cost me $5,000, but $5,000 might be near and dear to you, and I have to repaint it.
Which I think speaks to something we always advocate for, and you've been echoing in this discussion, which is build your team early, right? Because that gives you time to vet those people. That gives you time to find those right relationships based on referrals and talking to references and really starting to get a feel. If you're scrambling to find a real estate attorney at the last minute, you're really kind of setting yourself up for failure because you're not giving yourself time. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, and sometimes, the people's...
Might get lucky. Broken clock's right twice a day.
Exactly. Those investors, they're trusting their gut. They built up their little portfolio or the money on base with it, maybe without anybody else's help.
Yeah.
And maybe they actually know what they're doing internally.
Yep.
Maybe they have to learn a few lessons, right? Along the way, maybe those lessons are expensive. I had some other clients buy some 3 families with the hopes of converting to condos.
Right.
And they did very well, except they overbuilt for the market.
Going back to your point, know your tenant class, know your market, know the property, what it's going to rent for. I mean, you just, another example. With the last couple of minutes here, I want to touch on something that I know you're an expert in. We've talked a lot about in the past. Right. So I own a rental property right now, but I've decided that for certain reasons, maybe you can identify some of what those are. I want to convert that 3-family into a condo and then sell those off individually. Can you just walk us a little bit through, what are some of the decision-making criteria that would lead somebody to go from long-term rental property to condominium property? Right. And then what does that process look like?
So on the way, coincidentally, on longtime client, she owns a 3-family off of Broadway in Providence.
Okay.
Her mother's getting older.
Okay.
Right? She's maybe 50s, her mother's more. And she was like, I think I'm going to sell my 3-family and, move back home, take care of my mom, but I'm really not sure because I want to keep the house.
Okay.
What can I do?
Okay.
I asked her, have you thought about condominium conversion?
Right.
So the market's an all-time high right now. Sell, be gone, put the money to good work, let it do what it can do for you.
Sure.
Or you could convert to condominium. Converting to condominium is basically taking that same number of units, instead of making it one ownership, I convert it into 3, or if it's a 3-unit, and to 3 pieces of ownership. Each unit owner would own the interior of their apartment, so to speak, and then they would share in the hallways and in the roof and in the building and in the driveway and in the foundation. They would share those things in a certain percentage, depending on their size, depending on the declaration, depending on how it's configured, right? We have a lot of condominium examples, right? Sometimes
certainly they're out there now.
There are lots and lots of condos, and it's a great form of ownership. And sometimes what happens is a seller, if you're looking to sell, and we're just going to use imaginary numbers, right? But if it's worth $500,000 as a 3-family,
right,
it might be worth 200 and 200 and 175.
Okay.
Right, for that 3rd floor apartment.
Okay.
So you can maybe squeeze a little bit more juice out of that sale than just getting 500. Now you got 575.
So when you started this discussion there, it sounded like there were some personal reasons that they might want to condoize the building, if it was going to be owner occupied or whatever the case may be. Then you bring up another reason, which of course is financial. Shocker, real estate investors are interested in money, guilty as charged, not at the expense of all things, but to your point, it might be worth it to condoize the building because you might be able to squeeze a little bit more value out of it if you do so and sell them off as individual condos than if you had sold that same triple-decker off as one building. So there is financial incentive in some situations to do that, and you might be able to give some, obviously a licensed broker, real estate agent, and their expert advice could help determine the market value of the condos versus the rentals, right? And then for you, it's as much about, really, it's a legal instrument. You're really...
I need a surveyor to draw out a nice map of the exterior of what's being split up.
Okay.
There's also either the same surveyor or maybe an architect to draw an inside map of sort of what's owned and what's split.
Okay.
Right, so we can sort of discern, and then I write a declaration of condominium going through all of those particular points. This is how you're supposed to have your meeting, and this is how you're supposed to split up the bills, and this is the way you're supposed to act, and who owns what, where the parking is. Sometimes we allot parking, sometimes we don't assign the parking. Depends on the property and sort of what that declarant wants to see.
Okay.
Right.
Got it. So Marc, I want to give you, we're going to bring this to a close, but I want to give you kind of the last word, if you will, as far as advice that you would offer either to a buyer or a seller, a real estate investment property, anything you want to cover that we haven't already touched on.
I think part of the biggest thing in real estate is to be slow and methodical.
Okay.
I know it doesn't sound like, it's uber sexy and it's like, this is the best way to real estate, but real estate is a slow way to gain a lot of wealth, right? It's over time. I had a client yesterday, he's been buying 1, 2-family or 3-family a year.
Okay.
Right? It's now been 10 years.
So he's accumulated a few.
He's a great guy, works in, a regular job.
Yeah.
Right? And has just figured out, if I just save my pennies,
Yeah.
and if I come up with like 20 grand a year,
Yeah.
then I can finance the rest and get myself into another property. And over time, this guy's going to be, and he's 40.
Yeah.
Right? So if
Built himself a nice portfolio.
in the next 10 years, he'll have 20, 20 houses,
Yeah.
right? And multi-units. I mean, these are great ways to sort of build wealth, I think. And you've heard a lot of stories, hey, I bought a property for 100 grand and I flipped the contract and for 20 grand, I didn't do anything. It was so great.
Right.
You made 20 grand, you paid half in taxes, so you made 10.
Right. Was it really worth it? So
you could have made, more money if you collected that rent over time. For the next 10 years, you would have made 10 grand a year and then sold the property for 200 grand.
So real estate's get rich slowly, and just like the process of building wealth, if you will, is slow, be slow and methodical about your process as it comes thoughtful as it comes to buying and selling. Is that fair?
That's fair.
All right.
Fair.
Well, there you hear it. Marc, this has been tremendous. I really appreciate your time and attention today and all of the knowledge that you've shared with us. Hopefully our audience got some great information out of that. It's been a tremendous honor and pleasure speaking with you today. That's it for this episode of Inside Stonelink. Thanks for tuning in. Take care, everybody.